The morning began in chaos inside the towering glass headquarters of a global corporation. Phones rang without pause, managers rushed through the halls, and tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. The company had been struck by a crisis, one so severe that billions were at risk. The computer systems that controlled everything from financial records to global communications had collapsed without warning. Technicians and consultants filled the building, frantically typing codes and running cables, yet every attempt to restore the system ended in failure. At the top floor, the CEO, Richard, paced his office, his tie loosened, his face pale with frustration. He had called in the best minds from across the country, yet none of them could solve the problem. Time was running out, and every second meant millions lost. Downstairs in the lobby, unnoticed by the frantic employees, a janitor named Daniel pushed his cart across the polished floor. Daniel had worked in the building for years, quietly mopping the marble tiles and changing the light bulbs. Most people passed him by without a second glance, but Daniel had always carried a quiet curiosity about the world around him. He often lingered by the server rooms while sweeping, listening to the tech staff speak about their systems. He asked questions out of genuine interest, and over time had pieced together knowledge that few realized he possessed. That morning, as he emptied a trash bin near the IT department, he overheard the panic. The lead consultant was shouting that the servers were failing to reboot and that the backup had somehow been corrupted. Daniel paused his broom in mid-sweep, listening carefully. He knew something about that backup system because he had once helped a technician reset it late at night when no one else was around. Without thinking, he stepped closer and spoke softly. "I think the backup system is looping through the wrong protocol." The room went silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, confused that a janitor had spoken up. The lead consultant frowned dismissively. "This is no place for you, sir. Please step aside." But Richard, the CEO, had just walked in, desperate for any glimmer of hope. "Wait," he said sharply. "What did you just say?" Daniel repeated himself, more clearly describing the issue in simple words that cut through the cloud of technical jargon. The consultant scoffed, but Richard gestured firmly. "Try what he said." The technicians exchanged uneasy glances, but began typing Daniel's suggestion into the console. The room held its breath as lines of code flickered across the screen, and then suddenly the system hummed back to life. Lights on the servers blinked, green monitors filled with restored data, and the alarms that had been blaring fell silent. It had taken them 2 days to fail, and only Daniel, a janitor with a mop in one hand and memory in the other, a matter of seconds to succeed. Richard's jaw dropped as he stared at the screens, then at Daniel standing quietly with his broom. The entire room erupted in disbelief, some clapping, others simply stunned into silence. For the first time, the janitor was not invisible. He was the man who had saved a billion-dollar empire in the blink of an eye. Richard stepped closer to Daniel, his eyes wide with something between shock and respect. "How did you know that?" he asked, his voice low but heavy with curiosity. Daniel shifted on his feet, gripping the broom handle a little tighter. "I pay attention, sir. I have seen how the system works. When I clean near the servers at night, I remembered what one of the technicians did a few months ago when it crashed on a smaller scale." The consultants stood frozen, their faces red with embarrassment as they realized what they had missed. One of them muttered under his breath, but Richard ignored them, his focus fixed on Daniel. He motioned for Daniel to follow him up to the top floor where the board of directors waited in a tense meeting. When Daniel stepped into the grand conference room filled with men and women in expensive suits, the chatter stopped instantly. "This is the man who saved us," Richard announced, pointing toward Daniel. The board members blinked in disbelief, their polished image of control shattered by the presence of a janitor holding a broom. Daniel gave a small nod, unsure if he should even speak, but Richard continued, his voice steady with gratitude. "While we threw money at experts who failed, he solved the problem in seconds with nothing but knowledge and focus." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. One board member finally leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and humility. "Tell us, Daniel, what do you think we should do to keep this from happening again?" Every eye in the room turned to him, waiting not out of pity, but out of genuine respect. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt the weight of his words before they were even spoken. Daniel took a slow breath before answering, his eyes steady as they moved across the room. "You need to simplify," he said. "Too many layers of code, too many people trying to prove they are smarter than the system itself, when it is really about making it easier to recover, not harder." The board members shifted in their seats, surprised at how plainly he spoke, yet every word carried weight. Richard leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully, his earlier frustration now replaced with something that looked almost like admiration. The room listened closely as Daniel continued explaining how regular maintenance and clear backups could prevent another disaster. He spoke not like a consultant chasing a paycheck, but like someone who cared about the people working in the building, the ones who would pay the price for failure. The board absorbed every word in silence, their pens unmoving, their eyes locked on him. Finally, Richard broke the quiet, his voice filled with conviction. "Daniel, you have done more than save this company. You have reminded us of what we lost in all our complexity: common sense." Daniel lowered his head, slightly unsure how to respond. He had never been the center of attention like this before. The janitor, who had been invisible for years, was suddenly the one voice everyone leaned in to hear. When the meeting ended, Richard walked Daniel back to the lobby, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Employees stopped what they were doing as Daniel passed, whispers spreading faster than wildfire. "That is the janitor who fixed the billion-dollar crisis," someone said, and heads turned everywhere. For the first time, Daniel was not just a shadow in the hallway, he was the man who had left the entire building and its CEO speechless. As Daniel pushed his cart slowly across the lobby, he could feel dozens of eyes following him. The same workers who once walked past him without a glance were now whispering in awe. Some offered small nods of respect, others gave quiet smiles, and a few even clapped softly as he passed. Daniel kept his head down, but inside his chest his heart pounded with something unfamiliar: pride. Richard walked beside him, not as a distant executive, but almost like a companion who had just discovered a hidden treasure in plain sight. When they reached the doors, Richard placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and spoke low enough for only him to hear. "You changed everything today, and I will not forget it." Daniel nodded, unsure of what to say, and continued pushing his cart into the evening air outside. The sun was setting over the city, the tall buildings glowing orange in the fading light. He paused on the steps of the headquarters, staring up at the skyscraper that had once seemed too big, too unreachable for someone like him. Now it felt different, as if the walls themselves acknowledged his presence for the first time. Inside the building, the buzz continued, everyone talking about the janitor who had done what experts could not. And while Daniel walked down the street, the sounds of the city wrapped around him. He knew this was only the beginning of something larger, something he had never expected when he picked up a broom years ago. Daniel walked slowly down the sidewalk, his cart rattling softly against the pavement. The streets were alive with the hum of traffic horns echoing in the distance and the chatter of people leaving work. But inside Daniel's mind, everything was still replaying the moment the servers blinked back to life, the stunned faces of the consultants, the way Richard had looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. He reached the corner of a small cafe, where he often stopped for a cup of coffee after long shifts. The barista recognized him and smiled warmly. "You are the talk of the city today, Daniel. Everyone is saying you saved your company from collapse." Daniel chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I just did what anyone else could have done if they had been paying attention." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Not everyone paid attention, not everyone cared enough to notice the little things. He sipped his coffee and took a seat by the window, watching the busy street glow under the evening lights. Across, the glass towers of the company headquarters still loomed tall, but for once they did not intimidate him. They felt like a part of his story, now a place where he had left a mark that no one could erase. As the night deepened, Daniel sat in quiet reflection, unaware that inside those towers discussions were already taking place about him. Richard was still in the boardroom, speaking to the directors, his voice steady. "We cannot let someone like Daniel slip through the cracks again," he reminded them. "He may wear a janitor's uniform, but he has proven himself to be more than that." And while those decisions unfolded far above him, Daniel simply sat in the cafe with his coffee, savoring the rare feeling that his life had shifted in a way he never imagined. The cafe slowly emptied as the hours passed, but Daniel stayed at his small table, watching the glow of the city change from gold to silver under the moonlight. His thoughts wandered back to the years he had spent sweeping floors, emptying bins, and mopping marble hallways without anyone knowing his name. He had always accepted it as his place in the world to remain unnoticed, to keep things clean while others built their fortunes above him. But tonight something had shifted. The weight of invisibility was not as heavy anymore. The door of the cafe opened with a soft chime, and to his surprise Richard walked in, his suit jacket folded over his arm, his tie loosened. He spotted Daniel immediately and made his way over, without hesitation. "May I sit?" he asked, and Daniel nodded silently. They sat together in the quiet corner, the hum of the espresso machine filling the silence, until Richard finally spoke. "You know, Daniel, most men in your position would demand a raise or recognition, or even my job, after what you did today." Daniel smiled faintly and shook his head. "I never wanted to take anything from anyone. I just wanted to help where I could." Richard studied him for a long moment, as if trying to measure the depth of his words. "That humility is exactly why you are different," Richard finally said, "and it is why I believe you belong in more than just these hallways with a mop." Daniel sipped his coffee, quietly unsure what to make of the offer hidden in those words. For the first time, he began to wonder if maybe his life was not meant to stay in the shadows forever. Daniel shifted in his chair, unsure how to respond to Richard's words. He had spent so many years blending into the background that the thought of stepping into the light felt almost unreal. Richard leaned forward, his voice softer. "Now you see, Daniel, when the systems crashed, all our experts panicked, but you stayed calm, you trusted your instincts, and you solved the problem in seconds. That is leadership, whether you realize it or not." Daniel looked down at his calloused hands, the same hands that had scrubbed floors and polished railings for years. Leadership was never a word he had associated with himself, yet hearing it spoken with such conviction stirred something deep within him. "I am just a janitor," Daniel said, quietly, not to diminish himself, but to remind Richard of the truth he had lived with. Richard shook his head. "No, you are not. You are a man who pays attention to details, who sees what others overlook, and who acts when it matters most. That is more valuable than any degree or title." The weight of those words settled over Daniel, heavy and strange, like a coat he was not used to wearing. Outside the cafe window, the city pulsed with life, lights flickering, cars rushing by, people chasing their own stories. Daniel wondered if, perhaps for the first time, his story was just beginning to change in ways he had never expected. Daniel sat in silence, letting Richard's words sink deeper into his mind. He thought of the countless nights he had worked alone in empty hallways, listening to the hum of machines, the echo of his own footsteps, and the quiet that always reminded him how invisible he was. Yet tonight, he felt seen in a way that unsettled and comforted him all at once. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching Daniel carefully, as if he knew the man was caught between disbelief and possibility. "I want you to meet with me tomorrow," Richard said firmly, "not as a janitor, but as someone whose insight I value. We have roles in this company that need more than polished shoes and rehearsed speeches. We need someone grounded, someone like you." Daniel almost laughed at the thought, but when he looked into Richard's eyes, he saw no hint of mockery, only sincerity. He nodded slowly, unsure of what tomorrow might bring, but unable to deny the small flame of hope flickering in his chest. The cafe had grown quieter, the barista wiping down counters and stacking chairs, while the night outside deepened. Daniel finished his coffee and stood with his cart. Richard rose as well, and for a brief moment the two men stood side by side, not as janitor and CEO, but as equals sharing the same uncertain horizon. As Daniel stepped back into the cool night air, he realized the city felt different. Every light, every sound carried a new sense of meaning, as if the world itself was daring him to step forward into something more. Daniel walked home under the glow of the streetlights, the night air cool against his face. Each step felt heavier than usual, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of new possibilities pressing into his thoughts. He passed by the same buildings he had walked by for years, the same cracked sidewalks and dim corners, yet everything looked different tonight, brighter somehow. When he reached his small apartment, he paused at the door, staring at the worn handle and the chipped paint on the frame. This had been his sanctuary for years, a place of rest after long shifts, but now he wondered if it would soon become the place where everything began to change. Inside the apartment, he set down his keys and sat quietly in his chair, listening to the silence. His car was not beside him this time, only the echo of Richard's words ringing in his mind. "You are not just a janitor." Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes, trying to imagine what tomorrow would look like. Would he still be mopping floors, or would he be standing in a boardroom again, this time not by accident but by choice? The thought felt strange, almost impossible, but the flicker of hope inside him refused to fade. And for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to wonder if his life was meant for something greater than what he had always believed. The morning sun slipped through the thin curtains of Daniel's apartment, painting the room with soft light. He rose slowly, his body moving with the same rhythm it always had, but his mind was restless, filled with the weight of what awaited him. At the company headquarters, the lobby buzzed with its usual morning rush, yet as Daniel entered the building, people paused their conversations and watched him. The whispers from yesterday had not faded. If anything, they had grown louder, carried across every floor. Richard was waiting for him at the elevator, a rare smile crossing his face as he extended a hand. Daniel, this is the beginning. For the first time, Daniel did not feel like an outsider stepping into the sleek halls of the company. He felt like he belonged. The elevator doors closed behind them, and together they rose toward the upper floors where decisions were made and futures were shaped. Daniel did not know exactly what role awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain: he would no longer be invisible. The janitor, who once went unnoticed, had become the man who saved a billion-dollar company, and in doing so, had discovered his own worth. And as the doors opened to the top floor, Daniel stepped forward into a new chapter of his life, ready to face whatever came next.